NATO is preparing for the worst-case scenarios on its eastern flank, just as the United States appears to distance itself from some of its closest allies. NATO soldiers are now simulating forms of remote warfare, pitting themselves against mock Russian troops in complex war games. The results have shocked many NATO planners, raising fears that Europe is badly unprepared for full-scale tech war. While Ukraine and Russia race ahead in deploying battlefield robots and drones at scale, much of the rest of Europe is still struggling to keep pace with this new style of warfare. Amid rising tensions with the United States, NATO forces held the Crystal Arrow 2026 exercises to test new concepts and technologies for future conflicts. The drills were conducted in Latvia from May 5 to May 15, just about 200 kilometers from the Russian border, underscoring how close they are planning for a potential front line. Soldiers from Latvia, Canada, and several other NATO-allied states practiced remote warfare, using robots and drones to fight at a distance instead of always sending troops directly into harm's way. NATO troops were guided by Ukrainian armed forces veterans and Ukrainian military tech, learning directly from a country that has already fought large-scale unmanned battles against Russia. In these drills, NATO units deployed wheeled and tracked ground robots to equip the rival opposing force, simulating how advanced unmanned systems might be used by an enemy. Armed ground drones, working together with unmanned aerial vehicles, were able to push back the flanks of friendly troops that were in direct contact. Among the specific unmanned ground vehicles tested were the Ark-1, the Simba, and several locally developed innovations, giving NATO forces hands-on experience with different designs. Ukrainian combat veterans and tech experts were on hand to train NATO units on how to pilot these systems, sharing lessons learned from real-world combat against Russian forces. However, UGVs that depended on satellite signals struggled to maintain their network connections in thick forest cover, exposing a serious vulnerability in certain terrains. Despite these signal drops, commanders noted the strong psychological and tactical impact of the machines, as their presence alone forced troops to adapt tactics and rethink how they moved. The battlefield simulations showed how useful UGVs can be for strike missions, troop extraction under fire, and routine logistical tasks like resupplying units at the front. After the drills concluded, Latvian commanders pressed NATO officials to say when these robots would actually be deployed in real combat situations instead of just exercises. While NATO is still adapting and experimenting, both Ukraine and Russia have already raced ahead in unmanned warfare, treating drones and robots as standard tools of battle. Ukraine, for example, carried out around 9,000 combat and logistical UGV missions in March 2026 alone, showing just how deeply these systems are integrated into its daily operations. Kyiv has also announced a goal to deploy 25,000 new ground robots in just the first half of 2026, aiming to flood the battlefield with unmanned platforms. Meanwhile, Moscow has rapidly expanded its own fleet of combat ground robots, refusing to let Ukraine dominate this new domain alone. Russia has deployed heavily armored, semi-automated platforms equipped with their own scout drones, blending protection, firepower, and surveillance in one package. Wheeled UGVs are very power-efficient and well-suited for long-range logistics missions. But wheeled UGVs are restricted by mud and off-road obstacles, struggling when the terrain becomes too soft, steep, or broken. Tracked robotic systems, by contrast, excel in rough landscapes, climbing over rocks, trenches, and uneven ground. However, tracked platforms tend to be noisy and consume a lot more power, which limits their stealth and endurance during longer operations. Legged units boast impressive mechanical agility, able to step over obstacles, navigate rubble, and handle complex urban or forest terrain. But their structural complexity means they demand very high power reserves and sophisticated engineering. Logistical, engineering robots already being used to transport supplies, clear mines, and even extract wounded troops from the front line. Reports say Washington abruptly cancelled the deployment of 4,000 troops from an armored brigade to Poland, appending plans that were seen as central to NATO's eastern defense. This decision came right after Trump had already moved to remove 5,000 US troops from Germany, signaling a broader and more dramatic pullback from the continent. According to the Wall Street Journal, it was the Army Times that first reported the cancelled deployment, revealing the shift before officials had fully explained it. Some equipment and soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division were already en route to Europe when the deployment was suddenly cancelled, forcing last-minute reversals and confusion. Some US Army officials were reportedly surprised that Pete Hegseth cancelled a deployment that was already underway, highlighting just how abrupt and unexpected the move was. The decision to halt the deployment was formally relayed during a U.S. Army meeting on May 13, catching many officers off guard as they learned the news. Army Secretary Driscoll and Army General Larneve did not mention this looming move in their May 12 testimony to the Senate, leaving lawmakers unaware of what was about to happen. Earlier, U.S. military commanders had already submitted plans to carry out phased reductions, signaling that a longer-term drawdown in Europe was being prepared behind the scenes. The Pentagon has not clearly explained how these cuts fit into its broader strategy for defending Europe, the Wall Street Journal noted, deepening uncertainty among allies. Remember, Washington had previously argued that European allies should take the lead on conventional defense, with U.S. forces shifting to a more limited supporting role. Pentagon said, and I quote, "As U.S. forces focus on homeland defense and the Indo-Pacific, our allies and partners elsewhere will take primary responsibility for their own defense with critical but more limited support from American forces." End quote. This move is likely to resonate most strongly in Poland, the country where the U.S. Armored Brigade had been scheduled to deploy as a frontline deterrent. Poland's defense minister said, and I quote, "This issue does not concern Poland. It relates to the previously announced change in the presence of some U.S. armed forces in Europe. The rapidly developing capabilities of the Polish armed forces and the presence of U.S. forces in Poland strengthen NATO's eastern flank." End quote. The U.S. is withdrawing 5,000 troops from NATO ally Germany, the Pentagon announced on May 1st, following an order signed by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. The Pentagon said the withdrawal is expected to be completed over the next 6 to 12 months, as units are redeployed or returned to the United States. Officials noted that this drawdown would bring overall U.S. troop levels in Europe back to roughly their pre-Ukraine war posture. The move comes after days of tensions, as a rift over the Iran war widens between Trump and key European capitals, especially Berlin. A senior Pentagon official told reporters that recent German rhetoric on the Iran conflict had been inappropriate and unhelpful for alliance cohesion. The president is rightly reacting to these counterproductive remarks, the official added, directly linking the decision to the political spat. Trump had already threatened earlier in the week to pull forces after sparring with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who said Iran was humiliating Washington over the war. One Russian Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile could destroy an entire nation, Russian military analyst Igor Korochenko said in his latest assessment. He claimed that a single Sarmat, armed with more than 10 individually guided nuclear warheads, could theoretically wipe out countries such as France or the United Kingdom. The analyst warned that the missile could be used if Russia judged that its national security or strategic stability was seriously threatened. Korochenko added that the Sarmat can strike targets via both the North and South Poles, complicating early warning and missile defense planning. His remarks were made as he spoke to Russian state media outlet Sputnik, which published his comments on the missile's capabilities. Notably, the Sarmat is designed as a heavy intercontinental ballistic missile specifically for Russia's strategic nuclear forces. Earlier this week, Russia's defense ministry released video showing a test launch of a Sarmat missile from a silo-based site. The official footage showed the initial phases of the intercontinental ballistic missile launch, from ignition to early ascent. Russian President Vladimir Putin received a formal report on the test from senior missile force commanders overseeing the launch. According to Russian reports, Putin then reviewed detailed information about the Sarmat test during a video conference with top defense officials. Putin said that Russia has greatly modernized its nuclear deterrent since the early 2000s, citing new systems introduced over the past 2 decades. He also described the Sarmat as the most powerful missile system currently in the world, highlighting its payload and range. The Russian president claimed that the missile's total warhead power exceeds comparable Western strategic systems by around 4 times.
Work on improving deterrent forces resumed in Russia and has not stopped since the early 2000s. Back then we had no time for this. To put it bluntly, Russia was going through a very difficult period in its history. But after the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, we were forced to, I want to emphasize this, we were forced to think about ensuring our strategic security in the new reality and the need to maintain a strategic balance of forces, parity. That is precisely why, I would like to emphasize this once again, Russia has begun work on the development of advanced systems that have no equivalent anywhere in the world and are guaranteed to overcome both existing and future missile defense systems. We are systematically implementing the Nuclear Forces Development Program established in response to this. In 2004, we began work on the intercontinental Avangard missile system. Since 2019, it has been on combat duty. Then we developed the medium-range air-launched Kinshal hypersonic missile, which has been on duty since 2017. It is already being used during the special military operation, but work on its improvement continues, including on accuracy in non-nuclear equipment. Since 2025, the medium-range ground-based Oreshnik missile system has been on combat duty, which can also be equipped with nuclear warheads. We are finishing work on 2 systems with small nuclear propulsion systems, the unique unmanned underwater Poseidon vehicle and the unique global-range Buvesnik cruise missile. Now let's speak about Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile. We started working on it in 2011. In 2018, these works and the advantages of new prospective missile systems, including Sarmat, were publicly announced. Let me remind you what was discussed then and the advantages of our newest system. Firstly, it is the most powerful missile system in the world, not inferior in power to the Soviet-developed Voyvoda missile system in service with us. The total power of the warhead is more than 4 times the power of any most powerful existing Western counterpart. Secondly, and this is most crucial, the missile can travel not only along a ballistic, but also a suborbital trajectory, which allows it to exceed its range of over 35,000 kilometers, with simultaneously doubled accuracy characteristics and with the capability to overcome all existing and future missile defense systems. By the end of this year, Sarmat will be put on combat duty.